3D rigging is easy, and here's how it actually works. But what do all of these controls mean? We're gonna break it down. What we'll talk about. When you break it down, it's not that bad. There are 3 components to a rig. There's the skeleton, there's the skin, there's the controls. And basically you could think of it as like the human analogy, like what humans are made of. That's basically what they're trying to mimic, let's say an arm or a leg or the spine or a neck. And we want to understand each component individually. And when you combine them, that's when it seems complicated, but it's actually made up of a lot of simple steps or simple components. My name is Dwayne Elahie. I'm a CG Supervisor, been in the industry for 20 plus years, been mentoring for 15 plus years, have hundreds of students, a lot of them now with an annual salary of over 70K. I've been at these places: EA, Sports, Industrial Light and Magic, ILM, Pixar, Disney, DreamWorks, as many others. We haven't met yet, but you've met my work. You could check my work out at IMDb, as well as other AAA video games studios. I've worked on James Cameron's Avatar, Netflix The Witcher, and I've been the CG rigging supervisor for Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Mutant Mayhem. You may have seen these films and TV shows: K-pop Demon Hunters, Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, as well as these others. So a skeleton is made up of just a lot of different parts. So if I go in here and let's say I select the armature and I go into edit mode, so you'll see the bones, and I'll just remove the visibility of the collection for the geometry. You'll see that it's just a bunch of bones that are parented to each other. So for example, if I go, let's say, into pose mode, I could take, let's say, the hip move over there, the hip controller that moves the hip, and if I move that, everything will move. Press Ctrl Z to undo. In edit mode, you can't really see that move because if I were to move it, it's going to move individually, because this is in edit mode. That for an armature, that is to set up the skeleton, and then pose it actually keeps all the hierarchy, like in terms of the actual like parent and child relationship. But you can, let's say, go in here and say that you would like this bone to no longer follow with the bone. So this is the clavicle, or for the shoulder part for the arm. So we could call that this one clavicle, upper arm, lower arm on the left side, and this could be a spine. So right now, when you move it, when you go to edit mode or pose mode, we just change the representation to controllers, the circles to control, but you could always select it, go into the bone properties here when in pose mode, and then say take the use custom object. You could take that off and it'll go back to the default bone. I'll press Ctrl Z to undo that just so we could see it. But as you can see, if I want to move this and not have that follow, I could go into edit mode, select this clavicle, which is a child of the spine, and I could do Alt P and say clear parent. And now you don't see that dotted line there anymore, so that means it's not going to follow the spine. So if I go into pose mode, select this controller, and if you could see it here, like these controllers over here, they will not move. If I move it around, you see they stay in place. Just for visibility, I'll just turn these on. We'll turn off the control and the control visibility or the look, just so you could see, by going into the bone property and taking off custom object. And now if you see, if I move it around, it does not move. Now I'll undo, and I'll just make sure back in edit mode, I'll undo until the child-parent relationship is back. As you can see, each body part controls what's attached to it. So if I go back to pose mode, and I'll just turn on the visibility of the geometry. In pose mode, the armature stays active, and I'll just choose a rotation here. And these controls here are deforming the mesh right now. So the upper arm moves the geometry for the upper arm, the control for the lower arm moves the lower arm. So it works in a logical sense, kind of like an action figure. For this is a clavicle, and I can move that back and forth like that. So when you're designing a rig, you're trying to think of whatever kind of like the subsystems that you want to have control. So if you want bones for the spine, you'll put that first, and then after you have the spine made, then you're figuring out, okay, I want bones for the arm, and I'll attach it to the spine, and the spine will lead. And let's say for the legs, you want bones for the legs, and you want a system to control that and be able to point where the knee will go. And also, because you want the feet to stay where it is, you might want that system to be in inverse kinematics. So when you move it, the feet stay where they are. Inverse kinematics meaning that it figures out this is where you want the result for the last bone to be. So it's going to inversely figure out what the rotations of the bone should be to make that as the end result, as opposed to forward kinematics, where, let's say the arm here, if I want, let's say, the hand to go here, the wrist to go here, I'll have to rotate myself and try to figure out where should it roughly be. So that's the difference. You're basically trying to think of subsystems. Quick heads up for all you 3D artists watching this. If you've been grinding away at tutorials and YouTube videos but still feel stuck, I've got something special for you. I'm hosting a 3D character rapid bootcamp workshop where I'll walk you step by step through the exact skills studios actually hire for. It's not theory. This is the stuff that got me hired and working in the industry. If you want to finally build a portfolio that gets callbacks and interviews, hit the link below and grab your spot. Seats are limited, so if you're serious about going pro, this is your chance. I mentioned parent-child relationship. That is the basic concept of rigging. Basically, the parent object, in this case the upper arm, this would be the bone, moves the child, which is the lower arm. And if the child, the lower arm, if that moves, it moves the hand. So you're basically trying to figure out the order of operations, or the parent moves the child and never the other way around. The child does not move the parent. So we could look at this with simple objects. So let's say I press Shift A, add, let's say, a cube, and I'll move it. I move back to object mode, by the way. And I'm going to add, let's say, Shift A, and then I'm going to choose the monkey here. And I'll just move it into space like this. So as you can see, if I move, let's say, the cube around, the monkey stays where it is. And if I move the monkey around, that stays where it is. Now, if you want a parent-child relationship, you can even see it in here. The cube is in the outliner called cube, and the monkey is called Suzanne. If I select the monkey first, that's what I want to be as a child, and I want that to follow the parent, I hold Shift and select the left click on the mouse button to select the cube to be the parent. Then I press Control P, and in this case, I'll say object, but keep transform without inverse. That's a more technical reason in terms of the numbers, so when you rig, so you can zero things out, but generally I use this one. And now you'll see this dotted line between them. That means that there's a relationship between it. There's a parent-child relationship. If you take the child and move it around, it still moves freely and doesn't affect anything. But if you move the parent, now the child will follow along. That's the parent-child relationship, but the child never influences the parent. And if you want to remove a parent-child relationship, you could select the child and press Alt-P and say clear parent and keep transform. That means it will stay where it is. And now the parent will not move the child anymore because it's not a parent-child relationship anymore. They're independent. Oh, and I wanted to show in here what it looks like. If I select the child again, hold Shift and select the cube and press Control P and say Control P, object, keep transform without inverse. You'll see that if you're in the outliner in view layer mode, you'll see that the child is physically or visibly under the parent here as well. And again, here, Alt P and clear parent and keep transform to break that. And you see they're separate again. For bones, the pivot point or the joint rotation is a very fundamental part. So I'll just delete this. So if I just hide these armatures for a second here, armature and the geometry, I'll go into object mode, Shift A, and then say armature. And you'll see you have a bone here. And the thing about that bone, if I go into pose mode, if I select it, it will rotate about that pivot point. So if you want something to rotate around another pivot point, you have to go into edit mode and move where the bone will go. And that that part, the head of that, if I go into pose mode, that's where it's going to rotate. So why does that matter? I'll select the object, go in object mode, I'll select the armature and delete it. I'll show it with empties basically, and parenting. So if I do Shift A and I'll create a cube like this, I'll go into the front view by holding tilde, which is above the tab key or below the escape key on an American keyboard, go to front, and I'll just move this up. I'll just eyeball it. Of course you can press N and you can probably look at the number and it's 1 meter, so I could just type in 1, I guess. I'll press N to get rid of the N panel. So now if I go take this and rotate this, it's going to rotate in the center because that pivot point's there. A lot of times in rigging, what you would use is an empty object or a locator or something that does not get drawn in or gets rendered out. It's just there to help calculate. That's in some software, it's called a helper. So in Blender, they call it empty. So if I do Shift A and then say empty, it doesn't matter which one you take because they're all the same. They're just drawing for your own visible, for you to make it easier when you look at it. In fact, if you go here and go into the data object for the empty, you can just change it here as well. It will change the look. If you could see here, that's an arrow now. It'll be a circle. So it's just a drawing of it. It doesn't really change what it is. All it really is just a point in space. It has location, 50% has location, rotation, and scale on it. But what's useful about that is, let's say you have, if you're going to do a foot roll and you want it to pivot point at a specific spot, you could set it up where your controller will trigger different pivot points. So you could take, let's say this cube, that's child, hold Shift and select that locator, press Control P and say object keep transform without inverse. And now, if you recall, this is a child. If I rotate here, this is the pivot point of that. But you could set up your rig where, let's say you have a controller and you move it, it will rotate that pivot point like this. And you could set it up to say only rotate it up to this point. When you get here, let's switch pivot points. So let me undo the movement here. And what I could do is, let's say I create another locator, Shift A, and say, I say locator because it's called that in Maya, but in Blender it's called empty. I'll choose another plane. And this time I'll move this roughly over here. Of course I could press N and then choose, that's -1 on the what. If I look on the front view, holding tilde under the escape key above the tab, that's right there. Press N. So that's another empty here. So what I could do is I could say this, since this is a child of that one, I could say this is a child of this one. So select that empty, hold Shift, select this one, Control P, and say object keep transform without inverse. So now if this rotates, it's going to pivot from that point. I'll press Control Z to undo. And if I select this one and I want to rotate it there, now it's going to rotate from that point, but because this is moving that, because that's this one's a child of this, and that's a child of that. So when you do, this is the basic idea of a foot roll where you'll want to have multiple pivot points, is that you then have another controller that says, when you move the controller at a certain point, move it like this. And then once you move it at another point, move it like this. So you could have multiple pivot points with this simple setup with hierarchies and moving empties around. Another important thing is the actual orientation of the object. So if, let's say you want to create Shift A, I'll do another empty plane axis. I could move it, and let's say you have a certain object, one of your geometry that you want to rig is rotated, it's oriented in a certain way. Maybe you have some mechanical rigging or something like that. You could select this, and then you could turn on axis, and you could see the orientation of where it is, because you want, let's say, to take this and rotate it at a certain angle, and you want them to align. And when you do it with bones, it's the same thing. So if I select all these, and I'll delete them, and I'll press Shift A, go back to the armature. I'll press tilde and go view selected. And armature is the object. I have to go into edit mode to get the actual bone. So the bone is really just a pivot point as well. And the whole thing, what you're trying to do with the pivot point of that, if you go to object and show axes in here, well, that's the axis of the actual armature itself. if you want to see of the individual bones, just to show you, if I select this bone and hold Shift D and duplicate it, and I'll just move that out here, Shift D and duplicate it out here, and I'll just take this and I'll press R just to rotate it around freely, and then select this and press R to rotate it around freely, or maybe I'll just do this. Okay, so if you were to go to the object mode and then turn on the axis, you'll only see the center here because the object itself is the armature, not the individual bones that you see in here. To see the individual bones, I'll turn off axis on the object here. You have to go into the data properties and then turn on axis here. Once you have that, and then you'll see them on each individual bone. And a bone is really just a point in space. Every 3D software, no matter what you use, whether it's 3ds Max, Maya, or go into Unity or Unreal or whatever, they all have their own representation of bones, but they're just a point in space, just like a locator or an MT. And it's just a way to visualize to help you look and understand it. So if you select this, even when you move this is the head of the bone over here. You have the head and the tail, so that's the head and this is the tail. Even if you move the tail, all it's really doing is just reorienting the axis for you in a visual way. It'll be the same thing if you select this and rotate it. It's moving the head and the axis moves away as well. So this end here doesn't actually do anything. That's where the actual pivot point is of the bone. This is just a visual cue or visual representation for you to help orient the bones or see the directions going. Some software don't even have that. In fact, a lot of rigs, if I don't like using bones because they have all these inherent things that I'd rather just use, if I could, just empties or points in space, because I could set up my own rigs and mathematics behind it. But to simplify it, to make it easier, almost every software does a visual representation. So me going to an empty and placing that somewhere, and then turning on, in this case, the object, because there's not sub-objects, not like sub-bones in here, the axes. It's me orienting that. It's the same as a bone. This end part here, all this here doesn't really do anything. This one point in space, see that point in space, is the same as if you went in the object and select the head. That's that one point in space. They're identical in terms of mathematically and behind the scenes. But visually, when you're setting it up, it's to help you set that up. We want to talk about skinning or vertex weighting or vertex binding. Basically, how this came about is, let's say I created a cube. So in the past, geometry was just created back, I guess in the 80s, for example. 3D meshes were defined in code, and then they rendered them out. And when you want to animate them, you would literally go into, in this case, now we have edit mode, but back then is literally code line by line. If you select this vertex, you could actually have basically a spreadsheet here. Let's say I select this over here and go over, and then you'll see a spreadsheet. You see there's numbers. These are the vertex positions. So if you really want to get technical, you could select these and then move it, and you'll see those are the actual vertex positions. So back in the day, I mean, you could still do this. Nobody would do this, but you would actually go in and physically animate by actually going to and changing these numbers by hand. You work like in an Excel spreadsheet. You'll just go in, and then you don't see this. You actually just have like a text editor and then type in every frame what each vertex value would be. As you can imagine, that was not efficient. So they said, hey, this is not a great way for this to work, and not everyone's a programmer. An animator don't think like a programmer. It makes it very cumbersome. And this is a simple cube, so there's only, it says it starts at zeros, but it's actually 8 vertices. So 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 is actually 1 to 8. In programming, you usually start at index 0. So imagine every single frame, just with one cube, having 8 different points. Each point have an XYZ position. You have to animate that every single frame. If you're doing 24 frames per second, if you're doing film, which was most likely at the time, you have to do that for every frame. And that's what they were doing. And then you're like, you know what? This makes no sense. It's not intuitive, so this will take forever. So that's where the concept of skinning came about. So now, let me undo, so change the movements. I don't need, I'll right click and say join areas and join that over here. So that's where the concept of bones came about. where you could come in and say, I'll go and do Shift A, and I'll do an armature. And if I could select the armature, I could go into the data properties over here and say in front, so the bones will always stay in front of the geometry visibly, so you don't have to always go into wireframe or something like that. And what you can now do is you select the geometry, hold Shift and select the armature, and then can press Control P as if you're parenting, because you are parenting. But that's how you do it in Blender. Every 3D software does it differently. Then you could choose armature, and you could say, we'll say deform with automatic weights. So now what this does, if you select the geometry and go on to the modifier, you'll see that it creates an armature modifier, and you associate the armature which we created, armature 1. If you could do this manually yourself, you could select them and then you could go in and on here the geometry in the actual data, and now makes vertex groups. So you could actually do this stuff manually, like actually select the geometry, go to the modifier, add a modifier, and then you could search by like deform, choose a armature, then manually select it, then go into the vertex groups and create each one by yourself. Like you create a new one here and then assign each vertex in there. But when we did Control P and say assign automatically, it did all that stuff for us. So that's the difference. But now what happens is, now if I go into the armature, remember selecting a bone for an armature when you're in object mode, doesn't matter how many bones you have, it will select the armature as an object. So you have to go into edit mode, or actually edit mode actually poses it. So if you already have something deform, if you set up an armature for deforming, for skinning or binding, this is to set it up so it actually won't deform it. So if I move it, it's not going to move the geometry. So if you realize, oh, well, the pivot point should be moved over here, for example, then you could do that. Let me show you. So if I go into pose mode, now pose, the actual deformation is live. So what that means is that if I select this over here and I move it, the whole thing will move, because what's happening is we're going, if I go out of object mode, I select the cube and then go into edit mode. Instead of having the spreadsheet that we had before, and we have to go in, let me just show that again. Select this, go here, go to spreadsheet. Instead of selecting every point and changing every single value, what we do instead is say, this point, move with that bone. This point, move that bone. This point, move with that bone. And now, basically, if I move that bone, I select the armature and I have to go into pose mode. Remember, pose is actually to deform it, and it doesn't deform it, it's just set it up. Pose mode actually moves all those vertices because we said to actually move it. And if we said, hey, let's select this geometry, let me go back to object mode, select the bone. I don't need this anymore, so let me click join area. And now I select that and go into edit mode. And I say select, let's say, this vertex. And I said, I don't want that to be associated with that bone. I could go in here and I could put a weight as 0, or you could press N, and you could see in the item here, you should have, let's see. So normally you have the vertex weight. Blender is kind of particular of the way you select. If you do marquee select like this, like by like a box select and left to click and hold and select a bunch of points, even if it's just one, you don't see it here. You have to actually click on the vertex, and now you'll see vertex weights. So you don't see it here when you do like box select, but if I just click on it, you'll see vertex weight, and it'll tell you the weight. 1 means this point moves 100% with that bone, and that we didn't change the name, so it's called bone. And now, but if I went in and I said 0, type in 0, that means that we say that that vertex is assigned in that vertex group, but follow 0% of it, 0 weighting. Now if I go to object mode, select the armature, and then go into pose mode, because remember you have to move the bones in pose mode. Now you see everything else moves except that vertex. And now if I go back to object mode, select the geometry, go into edit mode, and you see the thing is this popped back because in the modifier by default show the result of the modifier in edit mode is off, or deformation. A lot of deformers have that off. That means it allows you to like change the model. That's why they do that. But if you turn it on, you'll see the end result. And if you don't want to see, this is the end result. And if you don't want to see the cage, you can turn that off to see what the actual end result will be. But anyways, with that turned on, you could see, again, if I box select, you don't see that. You have to click on it. In with end panel on, now you could see that you have a bone weight. And if I turn, well, the thing is there's no other bone to mix with. So it's going to go, as soon as you put one, it's going to snap to it because it's 100%. There's no mix between the other one. Now, what can happen is that if I go into object mode now and I select the bone here, and well, it's the armature, and I have to go into pose mode to actually pose them. To reset it, I could go here. I could press Alt R G Alt R Alt G for the rotation, or basically clear transform. So if you go to transform, to clear the rotation could be Alt R. To clear the rotation will be Alt G, and to clear the scales Alt A. Or I could just do Alt and it will reset it back. So let's say I was trying to rotate this, and I see that, okay, I don't want the pivot point to be there. I already vertex weight the character and I wanted the pivot point to be there. If I try to move it, it's going to move, the bone's going to move the geometry because I'm in pose mode. Pose mode means you're animating. That means the connection's live, deform. When the bones move, deform the geometry. If you say edit mode, you say, hey, I'm editing the setup of the bones, of the hierarchy. Do not move the geometry as I set it up. So if I want to go in here and I'm just going to eyeball it, and I said, okay, now I move the bone. I actually want it here because remember, a bone, that is actually where the pivot point is. Okay, I won't eyeball it. I go to tilt, go to front, and I say I want it to actually move here. Something like that. And now when I go back to pose mode, now it says, okay, that's your initial setup. Okay, now at that's my initial bind. Then from here, we're going to deform if you move the bone. So now if I rotate it, that's going to be the new pivot point. So the first versions of skinning or skin binding was basically that. We make a bone and we say, we want this point or this vertex to move 100% with that bone. And that was called rigid binding at the time. So that happened for a while. And then people started realizing like, hey, we actually want, when you have a geometry, there's some organic movement that is not hard surface modeling. If it's hard surface modeling, we know a whole piece stays rigid. So having it associated 100% with a bone makes sense. But let's say we go into edit mode. Remember, in edit mode, we could move the bones around for armature. And I'll press N to get rid of the end panel there so I can see. I can move the bone around for the armature and it does not affect the geometry. If I press Shift D, and let's say I added another bone here, right? Now if I go into, well, actually I'll select this and hold Shift and select that one. I'll press Control P to parent it and say keep offset. So if I did undo, Control P and say connected, it's going to snap it end to end. And this could be good if you're doing, let's say, a snake rig or something like that. But a lot of times you probably want to shift the child, hold Shift. So click, left click the child, hold Shift, select the bone and press Control P and say keep offset so they stay where they are. Again, these are just points in space. This will still work. And if you go to pose mode, now if I move the parent, everything will move. But if I move the child, it will not move at all because there's no vertices associated with it. So what you could do, let's say I want, let me go over the overlay here and turn on the wireframe. Let's say I want, let me go to object mode, select the geometry, now go to edit mode. Let's say I want this vertex and this vertex to follow that bone over here. What you would want to do is actually associate that with it. So how you can do that is I can select this bone, select this armature. Well, it's already selected, so it's already part of the geometry, so it's going to be aware of it. So if I select this object, and so then go to object mode and select the geometry, go into data, and I'm going to create another bone set. And this bone is called, if we go to the outliner, by default, it probably is going to armature under the bone, .001. So I'll select Okay, back to object mode, select the geometry, go into the object data property under vertex group. I press plus to create a new group, and I'm going to double click and name it bone 001. It's aware of it because I attached the armature to this geometry. How do I know that? Because I'm in the modifier. We have an armature modifier when we did Control P, it automatically did that for us. But if you did it manually, you would go to form, you do an armature, and then you have to select the armature here. And in this case, it's that. So even if we add new bones, it's aware of it. So now I don't have to go and do anything extra. I just add bones in the armature in edit mode. So now going back, while the geometry is selected in object mode, go into data with this new bone selected. What I want to do, go into edit mode, select these two vertices. With that group, vertex group I have selected, I'm going to say assign. And one thing I want to mention, how does Blender know that this vertex group is associated with that bone? Is because if you have the name exactly the same as the name of the bone, then Blender knows that association if you have the armature selected in the armature modifier here. So that's how Blender knows. So if you did it, it doesn't automatically create the vertex group if you add it afterwards, and you have to name it the same so it's aware of the bone. But now if I go back to object mode, select the armature, go into pose mode. Remember, if you were to move it, now it actually moves it with it because I associated the bone vertices with it. Now if I go back to object mode and I select the geometry, go into edit mode, select one of the vertices, press N for the N panel. Remember, you have to click on it, not drag and drop, not drag with a box. You have to click on the vertex, and in the item under vertex weight, you see now you have bone, which is that. In fact, this is the name of the first bone. You know what, we'll call it, we'll keep the name actually. I don't want to change the naming here as well. But bone is that first bone, this one, and bone 1 is that first bone, and both of them are 1. It's not normalized, meaning that they're both influencing. It's saying that if this moves to the left, let's say by 1, since this is, say, follow it 100%, this will also move to the left by 1. Or actually, well, I say left, the bone's left, or screen right. And this one is also 1. So they're not normalized, they're not balanced out. A lot of software has automatic normalization, but basically if I take this bone, go to object mode, select the armature, then go to pose mode, and I select this. If I move this, it's kind of like, well, it's not actually moving it 1-to-1, so it is actually blending it at the moment. It is normalizing it. And for this since this is a child, it's going to seem like it's moving too. So what I'm going to do is go into edit mode, select this one, and press Alt P and say clear parent. So now if I go to pose mode to move it, they're independent. So this doesn't move the parent or the child bone anymore, and this one moves, and you can see that it's both affecting that. So what could happen, go to object mode, if I select the geometry, go into vertex edit mode, and I select these two, what I could do is either go to the first bone and say put the weight to 0, or I could also say just don't assign it or remove. And that means that with the weight is 0, that means it's still looking at the values of, or considering how much to move with that bone. But if I say 0, it's just not going to move it. But if you say don't associate it, remove it, that means don't even look at what this bone is doing. But in this case, I'll just leave it like that. Go to object mode, select the armature, go to pose mode. Remember, they're not parented anymore. So if I select this one, you could see, well, it's still moving it. So actually, let me go back to object mode, select this geometry, then go to edit mode, select that vertex, hold shift, select that vertex. On bone 1, that's that bone on the bottom, I do not, oh, it's still on there. Okay, so what I want to do, I could type, actually select this, press 0, press enter. I could see on bone 1 there's still a value of 1, and if I press assign, it'll now be 0. Or I can press remove. And if I do remove, it's not going to even be there at all. But I just want to see to make sure it's actually not moving by weight. So let me go to Object, select the armature now. Now go to Pose mode to select the individual bones. If I select that bone and I move it, now you see that it's not associated with that. And if I move this, this is by itself. Now you see that this works, and this has been done for a while, where you could go in and actually select each vertex and type in the number of influence you want. That's kind of similar as if you still had the spreadsheet, right? And in a lot of cases, if you went in here and go to spreadsheet, and then I go to object mode to get out of the armature, select the geometry. Now you see for the under the mesh for the vertex, you'll see all the values for the position of it, right? Now the thing about that is, even if you're doing vertex weighting or skinning, this method, that's kind of not that different if you're typing it. So to make it more intuitive for artists, then the concept of weight painting came about. So first, let me reset these values. So in object mode, select the armature. I'll go to pose mode. I'll press A to select all the bones, or you can click on them, left click, there's only 2, or press A all of them. Then go to pose, clear transform. If you do that, it's going to reset it back to, let me press Control Z to show you. So the way deformation works in pose mode is, the pose mode is when you're animating it and you're actually moving the bones, it actually moves, it deforms the mesh. If you're in edit mode, watch, it's going to pop. The edit mode is the setup of where you put the bones. So if you were to move them, they don't deform the mesh. But this also means this is the initial placement of the bones. And when you go to pose mode, that's the placement of the bones. Let's say I selected that, move that over here, and I rotated it, right? Let's say I did that. Pose mode looks at the difference of the bones, how you animated it now versus where it is set up initially in edit mode. And that difference is how you deform the mesh. That's basically how deformers works. Almost every deformer works that way, right? So to reset it, if you select the bones in pose mode, when you go to pose, clear, transform, and I say all of them, that means the location, rotation, or scale, or you can do them individually. What it means is go back to what it was set up in edit mode. So whatever it was in edit mode, when you do clear transform, if I go here and I say clear transform all, it's going to go back to what you have set up in edit mode. So I just wanted to point that out. Now we're back in edit mode. To help animate this, let's say, to basically show skinning, let's say I could select, okay, well, I'm going to go back to take the armature, go back to pose mode. Now select that one bone. Now I have, I'm going to keyframe that here. That means on frame 1, remember the values of the location and rotation scale. And I could do that by hovering over the viewport, press I. It's going to put a key on all that. It means it remembers those values. Let's say go to frame 12, for example, and I'm going to move that because I'm in pose mode. That's for animating. You see these colors, or green means that a keyframe was made, but there's no change since then. Orange, this darker orange means that there's a keyframe on these channels, like the X channel for the location, but it was keyframed somewhere, but it's not a keyframe on this actual spot, and the value is different from the last keyframe. So I could also do the rotation. Now you see those rotations move. Now if I press I, now they'll mean, okay, you keyframe those same things, and now it'll interpolate in between. Now let's say the reason why I did that is that now if I want to adjust the weighting, I'm like, oh, I want this vertex. Now let me go to object mode. When you animate in pose mode, it remembers it, even if you go out to different modes and onto different objects. That's why I'm animating it. If I'm looking at this, I'm saying, okay, well, I select the geometry here and I want to go to edit mode, and I say this one, or click on it, because this one vertex right now is 100% on bone.001. That's that one. And if I want it over here, I could type it in a little bit more, let's say like 30% or whatnot. But if you have a lot of vertices and you don't want to do it by spreadsheets, that's why they created like the weight paint mode here. And when you have that, you could actually go in. Usually what you do, actually, if I go to object mode first, what you want to do is select the armature first, then hold shift and then select the geometry. Then the reason why you do it that order is because the last thing selected will give you the modes or you could switch to. If you did the other way around, if you did geometry, then hold shift and selected the armature, you'll see now you have the modes for the bones or the armature. But if you want the modes for the geometry with the armature selected, you do it the other way around. First, the armature, hold shift, then geometry, then go to weight paint mode. And now in weight paint mode, you could go into either bone selection. If you didn't have that, if you didn't select the bone before, you wouldn't have that option. You could go into vertex selection, and now I could choose the vertices I want to select if I want to in here, or I could go into paint mask as well, and then you could start painting things that way. And now with these selected, if I go to that bone and I can select this this bone over here, you have to hold Alt and left click. And if you go into vertex selection as well, you have to hold Alt and left click to change modes when you're in that mode. Now you could actually go in and paint where you want. So right now I'm in the viewport shading. If I go into shading here, I can actually see the color gradient. So if that bone's selected, the color gradient shows red means 100% to that bone, and blue means 0% to that bone for that vertex. And this is vertex coloring. So if I go, let's say bone select, and I hold Alt and select this bone, you see the gradient change, because for that bone, this vertex is red and this one's red, and as it goes up here, it goes to blue because it doesn't have as much influence. So if you want, let's say, to have that one red as well, now I could go in and paint it. And as I paint, I'm in paint mode, right? That's why you have to hold Alt, because if you hold Alt, it will actually select bones. But if you don't hold it and you have your paintbrush, and you can press F to change the radius of the paintbrush, or you can change it here like that. And if you hold Shift F, you change the strength of your painting, and then you could paint how much you want in there. Now these are low polygons, so you don't really see much. So if I go to object mode, I'll go to frame 1, I'll select this Q, press H to hide it. Now in this case, I'm just going to do Shift A, and let's choose mesh, and I'll choose the monkey, Suzanne, and I'll do the same thing. I'll select the monkey, hold shift, select the armature, control P, and you see armature deform. I'll just say automatic weights in this case. So now you could have multiple geometry being deformed from the same skeleton or the same armature. So now if I select the Suzanne and go to weight paint mode, animation is still on, right, because it had automatic weight. But now I could choose, oh, actually I can't select the bone. That's the case because I have to go back to object mode. Remember what I said before? Select the armature first in object mode, hold shift and select the geometry. Now go into weight paint. Now you have the option to select the bone. So if I go here, now if I'm in bone select mode, I have to hold Alt and click that bone. Now I could press F to change the brush size, and I could say, hey, I want to add weight to this, so I could paint onto this. And the more red it gets, the more influence it is here. And I say, okay, I like that. But you know what, here, you know what, I want actually to pull more on that bone. I'll hold Alt and click here, and I'll say, okay, let me paint a little bit here. Oh no, this is pulling a little too much. Let me hold Alt, click that bone, press F, make it a little more precise, and I'll paint a little more to make sure everything follows and maintains. So that's the concept behind weight painting. So this allows you to not necessarily go into the spreadsheet here and look at look at how many vertices there are. If you go in here, look at how many vertices there are for the monkey object. Imagine animating every single one of these every frame. That's literally what happened before. That's why basically 3D didn't look as great back then, and it was really low poly and very faceted because of those limitations. And these setups help eliminate that. And then when you're done, go back to object mode. I could turn off the wireframe. I can select this and right click and say shoot smooth shading, and you have that. What's common with these bones, if I press N to hide that. So when we first started out, like in 3D, you had just meshes, and then to animate them, you went into every point and moved them and animate them in the spreadsheet every frame. Then to simplify it, we had joints or bones, and you associated 100% to a vertex. Then to smooth it out, we blend between two, but you still were using spreadsheets kind of to do the mix. So then you have vertex weighting to simplify it. Now you have a little more complicated rigs where you have a lot more bones, but then you can't visually see them because the bones might not be intuitive. So what you could do is actually create objects, like you can make shapes that kind of associate them to as controllers for an animator to know, hey, this is what you're supposed to animate. So one way you could do that, and a lot of software they might use curves. You could do that here too, but here what's also common in Blender specifically, you could use an empty, let's say, and say a circle. And you have a circle here, and the circle, if you select any bone in object mode, remember that's the armature, go into pose mode. You have to be in pose mode. You won't see it in edit mode. Like if you go to edit mode and go to the bone property and go to viewport display, you don't have the options. But if you go to pose mode, that's for animation. Same thing, bone property, but in the viewport display, you have more options. And one of them, you could say choose a custom shape. So if I could select, let's say that bone, because I'm in pose mode, that bone, I get to say in the bone properties, select a custom shape, and I choose that circle that I just created. Now it's going, when I'm in pose mode, meaning animate mode, it's going to use that shape to associate and for an animator, so they know to take this as a controller. So that's pretty common to do it. You can go into edit mode and you see that the bone is still what it is, but in pose mode, it's going to use that controller. And you can get rid of it. If you don't want that, you can just press the X and it goes back to the bone drawing representing. I'll just press Control Z to undo that. Another way you could do this is, if I select this, actually let me go back to pose mode and I'll just get rid of the drawing there. Another way you could do this, let's say I go back to object mode, I'll select this, and in the empty here, the drawing, let's say I choose a cube, right? Now with that cube selected, I could say, let's say I want that cube to move that object over there. So one way you could do that, from that bone, I can select the bone. Remember, selecting a bone in object mode is armature, so I have to go to, let's say, edit mode. In this case, edit mode or pose mode should work. If I select that bone, hold Shift S, so now I can snap the cursor to selected, so the cursor will go there. Now I can go back to object mode, select this, Shift S, and I could say selection to cursor, it will snap there. So now my empty is there, and with the empty with the size, I could change the size to be this. I'm like, okay, great. Now I could say I want that bone to follow that empty. Now the thing is, intuitively, you would think, especially if you came from other software, if you select this bone and you could go to, let's say, constraints, and I say, hey, I'll add a constraint, and I'll say I want copy location. If I choose, let's say, copy location here, I say, great, now let me choose the object. I select the object and I choose that. And you're like, oh, great. But why did everything move? Because remember, in object mode, when you select anything, the bone, any bones in object mode, you're actually selecting the armature, which is just one object, not the individual ones. And if I go to X-ray mode, you'll see that the empty's there. If I select the empty, if I move it, it's moving the whole armature. I press Control Z to undo. If you're good at, that's fine if you're good at constrain object to object. But if you want to constrain an object, a bone to an object, bones have its own constraints. So select the armature again. I'll go to the constraints and I'll press X to get rid of that. You don't use the actual constraints for it. You have to go into object mode and I'll go to pose mode, not edit mode. You have to go to pose mode for setup. I guess I considered it during animation because it wouldn't. If you go to edit mode, you don't have that option, that blue option for bone constraint. If you go to pose mode, now you have the option for bone constraints. So there's constraints and then there's bone constraints. They look very similar and it could be very confusing to a lot of people, but that's what that is. So now in bone constraint, you can select the bone you want. Now I can select that bone, and now bone constraint will work on that individual bone. And I could choose, look, the same thing. It says copy location. It looks exactly the same. And I select this and I choose that over here, that empty. And now if I go to object mode and select this and move it, now that one bone will move. I could go out of X-ray. It will move. Now the thing is, though, you might see specifically in Blender that most of the time that you might not use outside, not most of the time, you might see convention that a lot of people might not use outside objects to constrain bones unless they have to. And they might use different bones that are not deformable. So for example, if you select this bone and go into edit mode and go to like bone property here, I think even in pose mode, yeah, pose mode or edit mode, doesn't matter. If you go to the bone property, there's an option called deform here. So deform means that if you were to use an armature modifier, it's going to be considered when you do the automatic weighting, for example, when you do when your vertex white binding, it's going to consider that bone to move those vertices. And non-deform means is not, but is basically using bones as like helpers, like as if they're empties or locators. Now, why you would do that is because now you could change like the look of it. You could change, say, select that bone, make it look like this, for example, and you'll use it as a controller. But if all the bones are inside the armature, then you could use like action clips for animations and things like that. You could just use one action clip for the whole thing instead of having it on separate objects. That's one reason why you might want to do that. So let's show something a little more advanced. So let's say we go to create an IK leg. So if I go into nothing selected in object mode, Shift A, create an armature, then I go into edit mode, I'll hold tilt, go to the right view in this case, select it, the head, move it up, then select the tail, I'll move it to this angle, Shift E to extrude, and I'll go there like that. Okay, that's great. So this will be, let me click the upper leg and then hover over the outliner, press period. This will be bone, IK, leg, upper, for example. And that other bone, this one down here, will be leg lower. Okay, now I have nothing selected, then Shift, actually I'll just go to add single bone, Shift A, while I'm in edit mode. And I'll select the head, and this will, I'll place that, let's say, well, I'll select here, Shift S, cursor to selected, then I'll select the head part of that, Shift S, and say selection to cursor. Actually, I'll just select here, and I'll move that whole thing, Shift S, selection to cursor, and that will move that there, including keep the tail oriented as well. Now I have to go into pose mode, select this bone here, and actually let me go back to edit mode, select this bone, because this is going to be my controller. So let me name it. This is going to be IK control, or let's say leg. Actually, IK. I'll call it CTRL for control underscore IK leg, for example. And now I'll select this whole, Shift D to duplicate, and I'll move that in the front. And this one will be IK pull, because that will be pointing for the bend there. Now I could go into pose mode, select the end of this chain here, the lower leg. If I go over here and hover over the outliner, press period, that will be the lower leg lower here. Now remember, I have to do a constraint. That's a bone constraint, not a regular constraint. The constraint will work on, a regular constraint will work on the object, which is the armature. The bone constraint will work, it only works in pose mode, and it will be working on what you have selected, the bone you have selected. Now I do add bone, and I say inverse kinematic, like that. Now I have to choose a target. The object is going to be this armature right here, and then I have to choose a bone, because remember, the armature is an object, and I want a specific bone in that object, and that will be the IK control leg, that's what I named. And then for the target, I'll select that. Well, I'll choose an eyedropper. Again, it's going to say, okay, it's going to be the armature. And I said, okay, well, what part of the armature? I'm going to choose the bone, the IK pole leg. That's what I named there. And then everything seems to twist. Now, if I middle mouse and turn around, what actually happened here is that if I select this and I move around, it's actually working. It's just that you have to turn that by going to the, select this bone. That's what has a constraint, the IK constraint, inverse kinematic constraint. And the pole angle, you have to move it. And this works the same way in every other software. And you can see it's around -90. So I'm just going to type in -90 degrees, and there you have it. And the other thing is, if you had a long chain, you'll see there's a lot of bones here. And what you want to do is change the chain length to 2. So you know that it's trying to solve, or inversely solve that. If I want this, select that controller. If I want this controller to be here and I want the target to go there, what do I have to rotate this bone and that bone to make it go there? And if I can do that, and this now twists to make it work like that. Now, if you want to do FK-IK switching on here, what you would do is you select these 2 joint bones, go to edit mode, have them selected, Shift D to duplicate it, and I press escape to keep it where it is. I'll go into the viewport, I'll rename them. I'll call this FK instead and take away the name of that. And that will be FK. Take away the name of that. I mean the dot like 000, right? And I'll just make sure the bone upper here, for example, go into the pose mode and bone FK lower. It still has a constraint, and I'm not using the constraint, so I'll select that constraint and press X for the FK lower leg, right? So now if I select this bone in pose mode, that's the control, that will move the IK legs. You could see, or I could go to the object here and you can see actually the bone name here. These are the IK legs, but then these are the FK legs, so not being moved, right? So let me undo to place them back where they are. One last thing with the FK legs, I'll select this, hold control, select that, Shift D. Oh, sorry, Shift D, you have to be in edit mode. So select here, because remember, edit mode actually sets up the skeleton. Now I do Shift D, it actually duplicates it, press undo. Now you could call this, instead of FK, you could call it like def or deform. I like to call it real, meaning that this is the actual real bone that actually moves or deforms the geometry or the character. I call this real instead of FK or IK. And now how this is going to work is, to illustrate this, I'll go into pose mode. And now I'll select this, and this is moving the IK, right? And if I do go to the FK part and I go to rotate, this is going to move the FK here, right? Now this one is the real one. This is the one I want to reel. What I'm going to do is just constrain it between the two, and then you do a controller to blend between the two. So what you could do now is select this bone, that's the reel. I'll go to bone constraint while you're in pose mode. Then I'll say copy transform. I'll just copy, meaning the location, rotation, and the scale. And I'll start with FK. So I'll select the object. No matter what bone you'll pick, it's going to take the armature because that's the object. Then in the bone, I'm going to choose the FK leg upper. So it's going to snap to that, right? Now I'm going to add, and the thing is, the influence is 1. That means 100% the constraint's on. And if I turn it off, it's going to go back to where it is. So I'll put that back on. Now I'm going to add another constraint. So add another bone constraint, again, another copy transform, but this time, well, again, you pick, no matter what bone you pick, it's going to be the armature because that's the object. And then under the bone of the armature, you're going to say IK leg upper. So now when that's on, it goes to the real one bone, it goes to IK. If I turn that off, it's going to the FK. So you're going to blend those two like that. So you basically have a control that blend those two, and you do the same thing for the bottom part. Now, if you want to see how to do a custom property for that, so first, these two joints, let's, because those are controls, let's go to object mode, let's go Shift A, go to empty, let's make an empty. I'll just put it here so you can see it. I made the plane, but I'm actually going to select this here, and instead of plane axis, I'll choose cube, so it's visibly a cube. And you could hide it because, well, it's not going to render. Actually, I'll keep it out for now because when I go into select this armature, then go into pose mode, because you won't have the visibility option in edit mode. You select the bone, go to the bone here, and then go to the viewport display. If you're in edit mode, you won't see these custom options. Now you select the object, and now it's going to take that controller type. And then here you could scale it down. I'll put it like 0.05, so half the size. And this one is going to be the same because that's the pole. So I'll select that, choose this, and I'll scale that even smaller, maybe 0.2. And this is just, let me go to object mode. This is just a reference to get the shape from, so you don't need it visible, so I'll hide it. Now go back to select this. Remember, that's an armature, they're all bones. So I have to go to pose mode to animate it. So if I select that and then move it, it will move the IK. And if I select this, this will change for the IK. Remember, we only constrained the upper leg, we didn't do the lower leg. This is just for demonstration. But the reason why I chose this is that, let's say I want to do an IK-FK switch or FK-IK switch on this, a custom control. What you want to do is make sure you're in pose mode or edit. It should work on edit mode as well, but I'll do it in pose mode. Make sure that bone is selected. Remember, it's still a bone. I just put on a custom object. So if I take it off, you'll see it goes back to a bone. I'll press Control Z to go back. And when you do that, every bone has a custom property. Now, remember, you have to do it on the actual bone custom property, because if you do it on the object, every object has a custom property too. But the object is the armature itself. So if you do a custom property and say new, you see that if you press N over here and go to item, you don't see properties here. This new one called prop. If you go, because I'm in pose mode, you're not selecting the actual armature. You have to go, if you go to object mode, now that new property shows up as prop there. So you can press X, get rid of it. But if you want to show up on the actual bone, like go to pose mode, select, remember that bone is, that's actual bone. I'm just using the visibility, the object, custom object, empty to display it. On the actual bone, you have to go to the bone, not object properties, the bone properties, and then do new. And you have a prop, and I'll call this, it's called prop by default. I'll click on the gear there to change it, and this will be called FK underscore IK underscore switch. The default value will be 0. So when it's 0 is FK, when it's 1 it will be IK, and the minimum and maximum is 0 to 1, and that'll be okay. So I press OK. So now this goes from 0 to 1, and I want that to drive the constraint weight. So if I go to the real upper, go to the constraint, I still have to be in pose mode. Remember, I have the two constraints. This is copy transform. That one I'll call it FK, because it's following the FK one, and then copy transform IK. So remember, I want the IK, the weight influence. If I put it to 0, it goes to FK. When I put it to 1, it goes to IK. So how to drive that? You right click and then say add driver, and it'll create this driver. But if I float away, it's going to go away. So what I like to do is right click and say open editor driver, and with that you could pin it, or you could choose the influence right there, and you should be able to pin it. So hopefully when you click away, it doesn't, actually still does. I think you actually have to select an object before it doesn't pin away. It doesn't go away. So you have to select the real upper leg, and the object I'm going to choose that I'm driving from is actually, well, before I do that, I'm not copying the transform, I'm copying a single property. So I have to select that drop down here. By default, it thinks you're trying to drive like a transform, meaning like a location, rotation, scale, or position, rotation, scale, or translation. No matter how you think about that, go to single property instead. And that means you're going to take the properties that you created. Now I select the object. If I select this, it's going to say armature first, because remember, an armature is the actual object. But now it needs a path. It needs to know from there what's the actual property name. How you do that, you actually select the object. And remember, this is that's a bone. So you don't go to the object, you go to the bone, scroll down, and then FK-IK switch. If you right click on that, you see copy data path. So now it knows the data path relative to the armature. So now if you go back to the bone real upper leg, we already chose the armature here. Now the path, if I go here, click on it, press Control V to paste, and then press enter. Now from the armature, it knows that whole path to that property that we created. And now if I click on the object the reel here, should the drivers and all that should be okay. So I thought it would not click away, but it's fine. I guess it does click away. But now if you click on here, you'll see the property shows up in pose mode for that bone, and it's driving the upper legs bone constraint, second one over here. Oh, one thing about that, I have to actually right click and choose open edit drivers. By default, all that calculation, that's the value of the custom property. It's called in a variable. This is kind of like scripting or programming called var, and it's going to be var +1. For some reason, Blender automatically puts a +1 on a lot of the expression, and then the output that is being put into the influence is this value, number 2. I have to get rid of that +1, and then press enter. Now the value is going to be 1. So whatever this value is, which is the custom property that's coming in, it's going to be the output there. And you can call this whatever variable you want, like I can call it my var for your expression, or for short for my variable. But if you copy that there, it will, and press enter, it was just an error, because this is an actual Python script, a Python expression. It doesn't actually understand that because that variable doesn't exist. So if I paste it, it said all this is going to be put into this variable, and this variable is going to be the output. And you could do extra things like that variable, whatever that value is, plus like 1.3, for example, and then you'll see it'll be whatever that value is plus that 1.3, because I added that, will be the output. But in this case, I wanted 1-to-1, so I'll just put it like that, press enter. You might have to do update dependencies to make sure it works. So you have to make sure you select the object, paste the path, and make sure I do single property, and get rid of the +1 here, and make sure the variable names are the same. It's a lot of things to remember, I know, but that's how Blender does it. Yes, I allow execution. Anytime you try to do a Python execution in here, you might get that pop-up because you're running Python scripts in here. And if you have a lot of them, it can get really, really slow, which is that was a huge problem back in the day with like Maya, for example. We're using scripts or expressions. So anyways, with that selected, now selecting this object, if I blend this now, you're going to see this is actually moving back and forth because you see where the value is 0.286. That is actually driving that bone under the constraint, that influence, because we put a driver on that, 0.286. To recap, we looked at parenting, looked at constraints, look at bones, look at actually where the spreadsheet is and how actually the vertices are moved and placed in terms of position XYZ. And we also did like skinning vertex weighting with that, and even a little more complicated systems such as IKFK switching. Also controls how they can be used to represent what an animator actually should interface with, as well as drivers to connect more complicated parts of bones or constraints, and in Blender as well, the difference between a constraint and a bone constraint, which is specific to Blender. So, of course, there's a lot of things, and it may seem very confusing at first, and a lot of things, if you've never seen the concept, let's say an IKFK switch before, why are you duplicating the same bones 2 or 3 times? What does real mean, or what does the form mean? But you'll notice that once you've done one, pretty much all rigs work very similarly, and so it becomes routine. So it may seem daunting at first, but this is pretty much how it's done. And it's been like this for decades now. And of course, you get more complicated setups, but they're all still based off of this fundamentals. And eventually, you can do these steps with your eyes closed if you do it a lot of times. And after the basics, you have every implementation will be unique because you're solving a creative problem for a geometry that is made from a concept art that came from someone's mind that you're trying to make work practically in real life. Well, I say real life, but at least in the virtual world, that a lot of times if you're doing a VFX is going to mix into real life. So something may look cool on paper, but it's up to you to figure out how to actually make it move for real. And you might have to go back and forth with concept art and modeling and figure out, well, how does this system works? How would, if, especially if it doesn't exist in real life, how would it work in real life? So it combines engineering, animation, UI, design, like user interface, and that's usually the controllers, or it might be some things that you might code for an interface for an animator to use, like a button panel, like an animation control picker or something like that. Next step is to apply all the methods that you've learned and put them in practice. And beyond that, this is just the basics. But as you can see, there's a lot of repetitive tasks, a lot of things you have to figure out. And the next step actually would be to actually code this. And once you've done, like I said, once you've done one, a lot of the repeated things of how to set up, let's say, an FK-IK switch. Once you know how it's done, you would code it and you would change the variables of like where the bones would be placed. And this is actually the technique or the valuable skill that allows you to rig thousands of characters on video games or on feature animations or VFX. And that will be the next level, or else you have to do it one by one. And that's what makes you extremely valuable. Bonus tips. Elegant versus complex implementation. What I mean by that is that when you first learn how to rig, or actually when you first learn to do anything in 3D, a lot of times you try to do everything you've learned and put it in there, even if it doesn't call for it. And in practice, the simplest implementation is usually the most elegant one. When you try to put in a lot of the features, you're probably putting it in there that nobody asked for, and it makes things a lot complicated for options that you may not even need. So try to look for an elegant, simple solution versus something complicated and convoluted. Think of, for example, Apple, how they make everything simple to use. It's actually very hard to make something so simple and refined, because it has to think of all the problems it solves behind the scenes to make it abstract. Whereas complicated implementation pretty much put all that in front of you. So think about that. Biggest mistake to avoid is rigging for the sake of rigging. Basically, what it serves a purpose. You're trying to bring a character to life. The point of animation is to make it feel that is not some pixels just moving on a screen. That it actually is a character that has a thought and has aspirations, and it was doing something before the scene and doing something after the scene. You want to suspend reality or suspend belief to your audience. And rigging and making things move for the sake of making it cool is usually not the point if it's not adding to the story or telling the story of the character. So what are your thoughts? Leave your comments below.